So have here today David Kirkpatrick, obviously founder and editor-in-chief of Techonomy.
Welcome, everybody.
And I think this conversation, really has been years in the making. At Techonomy, we had really focused on how tech could be a lever for progress for many years now. I think, as now I also oversee Worth, we're thinking about how business could be a lever for progress. So really something that's top of mind for many of us, thinking about things like stakeholder and conscious capitalism, ESG and impact investing, diversity, inclusion, and really the role of the corporation and business in helping solve some of these bigger societal challenges. As part of that, I'm excited that Worth and Techonomy will launch, starting next week, our application process for what we're calling the Worthy 100, which really will recognize companies, entrepreneurs, executives who are really managing, let's say the triple bottom line, that are really looking at the success of their business, but also through the lens of how it's helping advance some of the more social issues facing the world. So you'll be getting more information about that in upcoming weeks. David, anything else before we bring the panelists on?
No, I'm gonna make some more general introductory comments as we get started. But first, I think we should bring the panelists on and introduce them. So thank you. Okay, there's Andy and John. We still need Susan here, I think. And Josh, thank you so much. We're going to say farewell to you, I believe. We're using this new platform, so we aren't positive what we're going to do. But I think we know what we're doing. We have an expert in the background. Okay, there's Susan. Hello, Susan.
Hi.
Welcome. So thank you, everybody, for being here. And let me quickly tell you who we have with us today. Susan Sobbott. Did I say that right? Is it a second syllable or first syllable, Susan?
First, Sobbott.
Oh, Sobbott. Sorry. Susan Sobbott. I should have known that before we started, but we had a great phone call. She was president of American Express Global Commercial Services as the culmination of nearly 3 decades at American Express. And when she was doing that business, which was all the business side of Amex, serving businesses, she did a lot of interesting things in this regard that we're going to hear about as we discuss the topic of profits versus purpose. She's now investing, advising, serving on boards. John Iwata was a many years IBM executive. I knew him way back when he was just a PR guy who went around with journalists, but then he rose through the ranks to become senior vice president and chief brand officer in charge of all communications and marketing at IBM. And he left when Ginny Rometty left, more or less. He's now a scholar in residence at the Yale School of Management and a board member of the Center for Global Enterprise, which I think is going to be pertinent to this discussion to some degree. Andy Kessler is an electrical engineer, which I only reminded myself of in prepping for this intro, but most of his career was as an investor and a security analyst, which is when I first met him, following the PC industry way back when, right, Andy?
Yeah.
That's when we first met long ago. But he's also, for many years, well over a decade, I'd say, been the columnist at the Wall Street Journal with a column called The Inside View. And one of the reasons we invited him to participate today is that last October he wrote a column called To Serve the Public, Seek Profits. So let me just quickly give a few thoughts on the topic here. So, we have balancing profits and purpose is one way of thinking of it. The stakeholder capitalism movement is another way to think of it. ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues are another terminological issue that is often addressed in this regard. And it sort of all goes back to, in a way, Milton Friedman and whether he was right or wrong, or whether he even was correctly interpreted. But he famously in 1970 wrote a column in the New York Times called "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits." And I know when I was a writer and editor at Fortune for many years, that kind of statement was often made to me by my editors in the old days. I don't know whether that would be the case now, probably not. But also in recent years, we've seen a lot of dramatic developments in leaders of business trying to restate what it's all about as the problems of the world perhaps have become more evident, particularly climate, but many other issues, inequality, most notably inequality in all its forms. But Larry Fink of BlackRock very famously came out in his annual letter, I believe 3 years ago, making a strong stand that BlackRock, as the world's largest investment organization at the time anyway, was going to reposition itself slightly, or at least he was arguing that they ought to move in the direction of thinking about stakeholder capitalism, not simply the benefits for shareholders. Not too long after that, the Business Roundtable, which is one of the most eminent groups of CEOs of big companies, issued a statement along similar lines that stakeholders, not just shareholders, were now the priority of the people who signed that document, and included a lot of the biggest name CEOs. Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum has now written a book called Stakeholder Capitalism. And then we have people like Mark Benioff, who is a big part of the techonomy community, who's done all kinds of things over the years that many would say are inappropriate for a business leader, but he thinks help Salesforce or help the world. I'll ask some specifics about some of the things he's done when we get the conversation underway. But even just today, I happen to be, as many of you may know, a subscriber to print newspapers. Today's Financial Times, in the lower half of the front page, has an article about Shell's shareholder meeting, Royal Dutch Shell. And at the meeting, which I guess took place yesterday, Ben van Beurden, Shell's chief executive, said, and it was all about transitioning to cleaner fuels. He said that while the company wanted to accelerate the transition toward cleaner fuel, it had to do so not just, quote, with purpose, unquote, but also, quote, with profit, unquote. So this is a big issue of discussion in business right now. So that's the background. Now, so Susan, let me start with you. I'd like you to just tell us a little bit about how you see these issues and a little bit how it affected the way you thought of your work when you were at American Express.
Thank you, David. Such a pleasure to be here with everyone. And gosh, this is a big topic that I know we could speak for a week on, so we'll try and do our best in the course of an hour. Importantly, I think all of the things that you talked about, stakeholder capitalism, ESG, purpose-driven brands, are all in this spirit that value creation is inclusive of human value. It is not only about financial value to a specific audience, namely shareholders. And that's really important because there's no other institution in the world that is bigger and has more resource than the collective power of business. And business is, in fact, what has enhanced society through innovation and the commercialization of innovations over the course of time. And so it's really important for business leaders to understand their responsibility and their privilege, honestly, in order to bring those advances to society by thinking not only about their obligation to shareholders, which in fact is extremely important, but also to all the constituencies within the ecosystem in which a company operates. And that ecosystem, of course, includes customers, it includes employees, it includes suppliers, and one could go all the way to the planet and, of course, society overall. Now, how that impacted me at American Express, obviously American Express is one of the most recognized brands in the world. Its objective was to be the most respected brand in the world. And in order to do that, that meant really recognizing the power of people, not only the people who work at American Express, but the people who were part of the American Express ecosystem. When I ran the global commercial business, I was very focused on the businesses that did business with American Express. And our purpose was to help those businesses thrive. Their success would, in fact, drive our success. And so we did a lot to ensure that those customers would, in fact, benefit from things that we did that were not only related to revenue driving initiatives. So, for example, we created Small Business Saturday, which was recognition of the power of small business on the economy in the US, and of course, eventually went to, we spread it to other countries in the world, but small businesses are the engine of economy in many, many economies. Importantly, we created programs for women founders to really help women accelerate their leadership and impact on growing really innovative companies. Women are the fastest growing group of entrepreneurs. And we created programs like how to do business with the government and how to export. Those weren't programs that we charged for, but those were things that we did because it enabled the purpose to come to life, which was to enable our customers to thrive.
Right. Excellent. Thanks so much. And I should just reiterate, I believe we still have the poll available. If you haven't filled it out, please do, and we'll go to your results in a little while. John, so tell us a little bit about what, I know you're working very much in this area at Yale right now, but give us your big picture perspective on why this is happening now, how we ought to think about it, and what some of the issues are for you. I think you might be muted, or I can't hear you anyway.
You'd think after 16 months I would know better. Look, IBM's a 110-year-old technology company, and David, you know this well. Many companies in general don't have that kind of longevity, and it's unheard of for a technology company to be around for decade after decade. So all I'd add to what Susan said is, from the perspective of the corporation, if you take a view of a long-term horizon, and management, starting with the CEO, is there temporarily as stewards, then you're going to make decisions in the interests of the long-term success and endurance of the company. That's one thing that I certainly learned at IBM. The second is, CEOs don't think about economic theories. They think about winning. And when I think about stakeholder capitalism, I think it from the standpoint of stakeholders who have to choose your company to buy from, work for, invest in, and allow you to operate. And you have to create value for each of those stakeholders in order to win them, right? And that requires a thinking of actual value creation and differentiation. And in some respects, that's not new at all. But quickly on Yale, so as you said, I've been an executive in residence at Yale for a few years, and starting about 15 months ago, I've been fully focused on the issue of stakeholder capitalism through one lens, which is the how. In other words, to the degree to which leadership of a company embraces or re-embraces this idea of creating value for multiple stakeholders, is that just a mindset and a commitment, or does it also have to require some skill? Does it require even new management science, which is a fancy academic term for new techniques, new approaches, new models, new concepts? In other words, you can commit to it, but what do you have to be excellent at it? And in pursuit of that question, little team and I of collaborators have been interviewing people like Susan and Susan's old boss, Ken Chenault, and current CEOs like Kevin Johnson of Starbucks and many others, to see if there is I would say a gap, but a need, an opportunity for skills enhancement. And the answer has been yes. And maybe later we can talk about some of the things that have emerged from these discussions.
Good. Yeah, and I do want to do that. But let me ask you one quick question that you've also probably encountered a lot of evidence of in your interviews with CEOs and business leaders. Is this issue changing in real time? I kind of said that in my intro, but whether or not we know what it means, certainly we know there's more rhetoric about it. But in your interviews with CEOs, are you finding that they believe themselves to be operating in some ways differently now than they did, well, certainly 10 years ago, but maybe even 5 years ago, as a result of the consciousness of this issue and other related social factors?
It's mixed. So you take a CEO like Ken Chenault or my old boss Sam Palmisano, and I would, my interpretation of what they said is this really isn't new. I mean, companies that were founded with this ethos of responsibilities and of thinking about, as Susan said, an ecosystem of stakeholders, that is not new. Here's what they say is new. 9 out of 10 CEOs firstly talk about the change in the workforce, in the war for talent. They firstly say, we have to be much more active, in some cases vocal, and committed and authentic to attract and retain the talent, because there's been a generational shift. And if you want to win the kinds of talent that you need to compete, then you have to meet their expectations. And this new generation of workforce, as is not new, they do care about companies with purpose that make a difference. And they don't want just a tweet to be issued by the CEO. They really want the company to commit resources and action to it. That to the degree there is something new here, that I would say that's what we've been hearing. Okay,
I want to get back to this issue of whether there's something new.
David, can I? Yeah, let me just jump in for a few points here. 82% of employees, according to McKinsey, say it's important for the company they work for to have a purpose. And 72% of them say that they want that purpose to have more weight than profit. And another stat, 50% of employees say they are 50% more likely to raise issues with management, social issues with management, and seek management to take a stand on those issues. So to John's point, there is an increasing momentum around what employees use in order to make decisions. That's also true of consumers, by the way. Consumers are doing the same thing, in that they are buying and supporting companies where they feel those companies actually share their values, and they are making purchase decisions on that basis.
Those are important points, and thank you for those statistics. And as you and I discussed on the phone, almost bizarrely right now, partly because of the pandemic, but in some degree predating it, business is respected and trusted more than most institutions in society, which is really almost shocking, and certainly a change from what has been the case for most of the last few decades. Okay, Andy, what, if anything, have you heard so far that conflicts with what you believe, or not?
Well, thanks, David. Let's start with the premise. I mean, your session here is called Profits versus Purpose, and I think one way to look at this is that profits are purpose. It's the definition is wrong. A lot of what's being talked about, in my view, like setting up a company to have purpose to attract employees, is more of a marketing strategy than a business strategy. So a lot of what is talked about as stakeholder capitalism, in my view, is redundant, because companies already benefit stakeholders or they die. Milton Friedman, which you mentioned, the title of his article was "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits." Basically, to engage in activities that generate profits, and here's a quote, "so long as they stay within the rules of the game." So to me, profits aren't greedy. They've been given this wrapper of, greedy CEOs and profits are greedy. profits are a price signal. They're a critical price signal. It's the minimum value of gain to a customer, else the customer would just do and make the product themselves. So who gets the value of these products? In the recent Nobel Prize winner, William Nordhaus of Yale, in 2005 wrote a paper, and I'm going to quote, "Only a minuscule fraction of the social returns from technological advances over the 1948 to 2001 period was captured by producers, indicating that most of the benefits of the technological change are passed on to consumers." And then he quantified it in 2006 paper, and he said basically that producers capture 4% of the total social surplus from innovation. So in other words, the companies that are out there making products and profiting, and as Jeff Bezos said, customers are always beautifully, wonderfully dissatisfied. A constant desire to delight customers drives us, meaning Amazon, to constantly invent on our behalf. But Amazon and Jeff Bezos and his billions, or half of it right now, only captures 4% of it. Society captures the rest. And therefore, this whole stakeholder capitalism versus profits is, in my view, a misnomer.
So in other words, would you say that CEOs don't need to think about purpose per se? They more or less need to do what they've always done, and a new terminology, a new language is not required?
I don't have a problem with CEOs being active on their own time. In fact, that's what Milton Friedman said in his paper. And he says, that corporations that are driven by social purpose force others, again, I'll quote here, to contribute against their will to social causes favored by activists. So if you look at it through the lens that if you're playing within the rules of the game, that profits are the purpose of the company, that they do generate wealth for society. And a company that's generating profits is one that's growing, and it's hiring more workers, and it's helping the community that they're living in. Those are the things that are important, rather than ESG and sort of the word salad of all the stakeholder capitalism things that are fashionable these days.
Okay. John, you got any way to want to reply to that? Or
Yeah.
It's kind of accusing you of word salad, I hate to say.
Well, I don't love the term stakeholder capitalism, but it's not social capitalism. So the role previously played by the shareholder is not now being played by, quote, society. It is not saying primacy of saving the planet. It's not primacy of doing social good. It's saying, acknowledging that many stakeholders bear on the success of the enterprise. Partners do, suppliers do, employees obviously do. And therefore, you have to have a strategy to win them, to have the best partners, the best suppliers, the best workforce. And that has to be, sometimes there are tensions, sometimes those are in opposition, and you have to manage those things creatively, strategically. This is not social capitalism. That may be a different discussion. It's about stakeholder capitalism. And I think this is often the distortion in these discussions, that it's either profits or it's stakeholders, but stakeholders are swapped out quickly for what Andy talked about, which is society, and that's not stakeholder capitalism.
I invite any of you to jump in at any time. Well, Susan, and I'm curious, when you were at Amex and you were making all these quite innovative programs that helped small businesses, helped minority businesses, owned businesses, helped entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs, etc., which did not, those activities cost you money. They did not specifically, you were not doing them because you could measure specifically, in most cases, I assume, that you issued more cards and made more profit. But did you conclude and were you able to measure that in the end that actually helped your business in a concrete financial way?
Well, of course, every investment you make, you want to measure. And as we know, from our business school days, what gets measured gets done. And so, of course, we try and put as much measurement around anything that we do. However, I think what we're talking about here is that there are some things that we can't measure precisely, and we can't measure precisely in the short term. And I think what we learned at American Express is that it's not just about measuring a program. It's really how the values of the company influence all of the programs and all of the policies. And that is what actually informs and serves stakeholders across the board. And ultimately, the measure is in the financial value of the company, but it is also in the value of the brand. As John said, IBM has lasted over 100 years. Amex is, older than that. And these are brands that have stood the test of time because of their contribution to creating value in a broader way. Now, one thing I would also add is that today we're in a unique moment. I think we're in a moment where transparency is our daily existence. So every decision that is made by a CEO or by a company suddenly becomes fully available to everyone who's a part of their system and to society. And as a result, there are implications to those decisions that are judged, and they're judged by consumers, and they're judged by employees, and they're judged by suppliers. And that transparency, I think, is one of the things that is changing the way that we manage businesses today. Our kids were born with a smartphone in their hand, and that has lots of implications, not the least of which they can see what is happening to the environment. They are reading news stories daily about how their future is being impacted by the decisions that business leaders make today.
Yeah. I want to just quickly go to the results of the poll so we know what the audience thinks about some of this stuff. The first question was, is there an inherent trade-off between profits and purpose? 24% of people said yes, that there is an inherent trade-off. However, the overwhelming majority, 59%, said no, there isn't a trade-off. The rest were unsure. Then the second question was, do you think many companies are factoring in diverse stakeholders as much as their shareholders? The majority said overwhelmingly no, they do not think many companies are factoring in diverse stakeholders now. 35% said yes. Now, the third question was, would you prefer as an individual to support companies that prioritize their purpose-driven mission? This is interesting. 81% of people said yes, of the people who are here today. And finally, would you be willing to invest in a purpose-driven company even if there were slightly lower returns? 71% said yes, and I wouldn't be surprised if Andy is skeptical of that. But certainly, this audience is saying purpose matters. They'll take lower returns. They'll buy more if they see purpose being displayed. Andy, any thoughts on any of that?
Yeah, first of all, some of those poll results were contradictory in terms of whether profit and purpose, and then the last one about investing in a company that had purpose. But let's agree on one thing, is that the job of the CEO is the hardest job in the world. I mean, I'm not saying that therefore they're worth, $50 million salaries. That's a whole nother discussion. But being a CEO is tough because you're getting beat up from everybody, from all the stakeholders, if you will, right? To bend how they run the company to benefit each of them. And so I have two examples. And one is Microsoft's latest CEO, Satya Nadella. And I think he has done a terrific job. He's taken the company and turned it towards cloud, et cetera, et cetera. And I was watching him being interviewed by one of his, actually by his old boss, a guy that he used to report to, who was one of Bill Gates' minions back in the day when it was just a software company. And inevitably, I call it the trap question.
Well, that you said, I think you told me that was Jeff Rakes, and he's also the one who ran the Gates Foundation for a while. I think.
Right. Okay. I wasn't going to mention the name, but why not?
What the hell?
But Rakes asked what I call the trap question, which is as soon as you answer the question, it's almost as if you're guilty of what, the whole, when did you stop beating your wife, or when did you stop beating earnings estimates, if you will, for a company. But the question was, hey, what are you doing about income inequality and climate change and diversity? I mean, it was just like unloaded on him, what are you doing about all these ills? And Nadella was very calmly, he said, listen, here's what I do. I use the words of this Oxford economist, Colin Mayer, who said very simple, and by the way, the World Economic, the WF has somewhat adopted this as well. And he said, very simply, and he said, the social purpose of a company is to find profitable solutions to the challenges of people and planet. Boom, done, and stop. And I think every CEO should have that, write it with a Sharpie on the inside of his eyelids as an answer to that trap question. And Nadella went on and he said, listen, driving broad economic growth is perhaps the biggest thing that a company can do. Again, so we can hire more workers, do more for society. Again, a quote, in order to have the pie distributed evenly, which I'm not sure that was his end game, the pie should first grow. And that's the whole idea. Let's keep growing this pie, because then all the stakeholders by definition will be more satisfied, and society will be much better off. So let me do that in contrast with another CEO who also had a very tough job, and was the CEO of Danone, I think it's a French company, Emmanuel Faber. And he checked all the boxes. He promoted stakeholder capitalism. He favored ESG investment criteria. He set the company up as I'm going to butcher my high school French, entreprise à mission. It's a purpose-driven company. He even reported carbon-adjusted earnings. I mean, who does that, right? I mean, he was the perfect example of a stakeholder capitalism follower. He did everything except he didn't grow the company, and he forgot to make return on investment. The company went through 5 restructurings. March 15th, he was fired. So, it's a very difficult job being a CEO. But in my view, if Danone, and as Nadella does, is focus on profitable solutions to the challenges of people and planet, then they will address, by definition, a lot of the stakeholder capitalism desires.
Okay. Hey, we people are not using the Q&A function, which I would like them to do if they can remember to do so. But in the chat, I see somebody, Peter Lukash, is saying that you just contradicted yourself, Andy, according to him, that what you just said, which I guess was your quote from Satya, that is different than the flat statement you made at the outset that a business's sole purpose is profit for shareholders. Or maybe you didn't really mean to say a business's sole purpose is profit for shareholders, or maybe you did. But how do you respond?
Well, I don't know where the contradiction is. I quoted Colin Mayer. I'm going to say it again. The social purpose of a company is to find profitable solutions to the challenges of people and planet. That is the purpose.
Okay.
Profits are the purpose. It's the same thing.
All right. John or Susan, any thoughts? And then I have a specific question, but feel free to jump in with anything. No?
Well, I think it's on. Go ahead, John.
Go ahead. No, Susan, please.
I mean, I think that there are many businesses that are successful that are illegal. And there are many businesses that have tremendous social impact that are unsuccessful. And I think the quality of a business model is what determines how successful one can be in the context of managing to multiple objectives across the board. So I don't think we can judge if a business is falling on hard times, it's because they are not looking after profits. I think there are many considerations that impact the success of a business. What I will say is that it is not impossible to have the interests of society and the planet and people in mind, as well as the interests of profits, in order to be success. And I think we're all saying that.
Yeah. Well, I'm hoping to find some really radical disagreement, and I think maybe we'll get to that in a minute. But because you're sort of converging, but not totally. So, John, what would you say?
I'll add to this. I'd quote the Wall Street Journal's interview with Satya Nadella of February 1st, 2019. Asked, what was the biggest thing you didn't expect about being a CEO? Mr. Nadella, I was not exposed to how multi-constituent the world really is. And the idea that as a CEO, you need to create that continuous balance between the multiple constituents is the real job, not generating profits. The real job, says Mr. Nadella, is that continuous balance between multiple constituents. He says this, I don't think I would have understood it day one because there was no preparation for it. So for all the business schools out there, and for all of the HR departments of corporations, including Microsoft, that's quite an indictment when you say a successful CEO asks what was the most important part of the job. He describes it as that intersection of multiple constituents, and he says he had no preparation for it. If it was just maximizing profits, there's plenty of preparation for that.
Right. But that might be also interpreted as just good management. You know, the reality is the CEO is subject to many conflicting pressures, and the job of the leader is to make tough choices, right?
So David, so in these discussions with leaders, I've asked them, when you're in that intersection and customers want more of this and employees want that and society wants this, do you think about that as the art of making trade-offs, of finding common ground, of negotiation, of elegant compromise or tough decisions? And 100% of them said, sometimes, yes, trade-offs have to be made. Most of the time, though, when you bring together those requirements, they set the conditions for new thinking, for new solutions, or in a phrase that you will understand here, for business innovation of different forms. And I think what Susan did and led at Amex around not just Small Business Saturday, but small business vibrancy was quite a good example of that.
Okay. I mean, this issue of whether there's a conflict between profits and purpose, I think can be seen a little bit as how long-term of a thinker you want to be, because a lot of the things that I've been hearing really suggest that if you're really purpose-driven, ultimately it's better for your brand and your business anyway. So it seems like John and Susan at least believe that, tell me if I'm right, that if you really understand purpose and stakeholder needs, let's stick with stakeholder, not purpose, stakeholder needs and wants and values sufficiently, that will be a positive for the brand and the company's long-term viability and ultimately profits. Am I right? Can you just nod if I got that? Would you say you both agree with that?
Yes, I believe that if you are managing across stakeholders, understand their needs and seek to satisfy, for lack of a better word, all of the constituencies that are part of the firm, over time, that should provide value.
Yeah. John, you didn't nod, so did I get it roughly right in your view?
No, I'm nodding now. I agree with you.
All right. But Andy, would you nod at that too?
Well, yeah, but I'll go back to what John said earlier. That's nothing new. I mean, companies that have existed for 110 years, let alone, 25 years, already do that. I mean, that's what a CEO always has to balance.
Okay.
But it doesn't mean that, you lower your profits to, because some constituency comes up and says, oh, you have to reduce, output of carbon dioxide, or you have to hire more of this people. I mean, that comes naturally for a successful company.
Okay.
But if you take your eye off of the profit side, then you're damaging the ability of that company to serve all those constituencies on a long-term basis. That's my point.
Let's look at some very specific examples that are very recent. You know, we have this whole controversy over voting rights in Georgia, and we have corporate activism at a level that we've almost never seen. Major League Baseball moving the All-Star game out of Atlanta, for example. Many companies, Salesforce being the first one, in fact, that spoke out loudly saying they would, you know, either remove operations or in some ways significantly try to penalize Georgia if in their own business if the law was not changed. And many other companies came out with very strong statements. I'm curious, John and Susan first, how did you feel about the way companies responded to that? And in specific, Major League Baseball, since they took such a concrete step. Either one of you, John or Susan, please.
John, you go first.
You go
Yeah. Sure. I mean, I would broaden it past that controversy you described, David. The question here is, what rigor do you apply? What logic do you apply to help a company decide its positions, what its policies are, when it speaks out? It's not about the tweet. It's about what's behind it. And I think all too often companies, the answer is the CEO decided to say something or to not say something, or the loudest voice around the table prevailed. But other companies do apply some rigor. It may not be a formal process. It may just be something that is institutionalized. For example, our values. You know, our values here and our commitments to what we've long stood for. And see, if you only held up a profit lens, you would say, well, is this going to help business or hurt business? That is a lens. That is absolutely an appropriate lens. Is it relevant to my business? Is this going to have an impact on my business, my customers? Will it change demand, et cetera? But there are other lenses too. Those lenses are values. Those lenses are history. You know, if you're dealing with an American Express or an IBM, how have we behaved as a company on any given issue decade after decade? And it doesn't handcuff us to an action today, but we have to be mindful of the fact that this may be a departure from prior practice, or it may be consistent with that. And I think that's the kind of rigor that applies to issues like this, because there's no shortage of them, as you well know.
Okay, John, but if that decision could result in lower profit in the short to medium term, it still might be the right decision depending on how important that ethical or moral issue was to that company's leaders or employees or what?
Yes, and I say that it depends on the company, and it depends on their values, and it depends on their track record.
Okay, but let me just see if I can characterize your answer to my question, which you didn't answer. It sounds like regarding Major League Baseball, what you would say is it's not for us to decide. They must have had their reasons, and presumably they made such an analysis before they took that move, so you don't criticize it. Is that fair sort of summary?
That's a fair summary, because I think each company, even Ken Chenault would say, each company has to decide for itself what its values are, but they must stand by them. In other words, if you have articulated the values and principles consistent with democracy and so forth, then doesn't that compel you to do something here? And I think that was what Ken would say, is to think about your principles.
Okay, well, Susan,
next
to what Ken would say. So Susan, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I would add that I do think it comes down to values. The thing about it, though, is there's judgment in that, right? There's always the judgment, and someone has to be the decision maker. And I think that's why it does come down to the CEO. Though I will tell you, in my conversations with CEOs, many are concerned about how their board feels about them taking positions. Right. And I think to the point that was made, these are things that you need to decide before the event occurs. You need to have a perspective on what you stand for and what matters to you. And of course, you exercise judgment in that moment. But let's take the example of CVS when they eliminated selling cigarettes. You know, that was a really big decision that was made that had strong profit implications.
Great example. Yeah.
And that was a decision that had, in the near term, a loss of revenue. However, it was the decision was made to be consistent with the principle that CVS stood for health.
Yeah.
And how could one be propagating something that was so unhealthy? So I think that companies and CEOs and business leaders make decisions every day that have profit implications, and should, because it's a matter of managing over time, not just in the immediate term.
Well, thank you for bringing up that CVS example, because it was quite an amazing example. Andy, so first of all, what did you think? Do you think the CVS decision to stop selling cigarettes could have been justified, and or do you criticize it intrinsically? What do you think about that?
Let me start with let me get to that, but let me start with both the bathroom ban and the Georgia voting,
which is also now Texas and plenty of other states too. Yeah.
Right. But the Major League Baseball moving the All-Star game out of Georgia to Colorado, which is a state which probably actually has worse voting rights, but that's not what I'm talking about. I think CEOs should have opinions, and if they want, should be activists, but they need to do it on their own time, and because boycotts are a very slippery slope. I mean, you can go through the history of boycotts in Nazi Germany, boycotting Jewish businesses. You can go through a lot of examples of them, and in this country we have a democratic process for change. So when you do boycotts, you're bypassing the democratic process. So if the company wants to hire lobbyists, if the CEO wants to be very visible out on Twitter and whatever else, saying, you know, these laws are wrong, they need to be changed. But as soon as you have a boycott, I think you've stepped over the line, and you've brought the corporation in rather than the individual CEO.
So you would apply that to the MLB moving out of Georgia example?
Precisely.
You think that was wrong? You think that was just plain wrong?
No, I absolutely do think that's wrong, and I think you know, Manfred could have used his platform as commissioner outside of Major League Baseball to push for change. You know, he can use his own personal brand to lobby, to talk to legislatures in that state and say, you know, this needs to change. But to do a boycott, I have a bad, because we can come up with a lot of examples of product boycotts, you know, that none of us would like.
Another really concrete example, which was a threatened boycott, was when Mike Pence was governor of Indiana and he signed a law that legalized discrimination against gay people. Mark Benioff was the first, and he organized a number of other companies to essentially say they would reduce their business in the state of Indiana if that law was not rescinded. And he had just recently purchased Direct Target based in Indianapolis, and he threatened to move it out of the state and also cancel their 10,000 person customer event soon to happen if they didn't change that law. And because of the pressure, even Walmart and Apple got involved. That law was rescinded in 9 days. So that was specifically an example of a boycott. You think that was wrong, Andy, right?
Again, I think you know, outside of Salesforce, he could have used his personal platform to push for change. But again, you know, you can either agree or disagree with the end result. But think of the examples where a boycott might go against something that you disagree with. And again, boycotts are a slippery slope, and corporate activism is a slippery slope. And as far as CVS, yes, they have a health brand, and so, you know, they have the right to sell whatever products they want. I don't consider that necessarily a boycott, although in some respects it is. But, you know, part of the other problem is if they don't sell cigarettes, someone down the block will. And so, you know, again, it's a fine line. Cigarettes aren't illegal, If they want to lobby for, more warnings, I'm more for personal choice.
Okay.
So again, I'm very careful in whenever I see corporate activism, because it's a slippery slope on how it can be applied. There's a lot of ways that it can be applied that none of us would like.
Incidentally, in the same Financial Times story about the Royal Dutch Shell shareholder meeting, the CEO specifically said exactly what you just said. If we don't supply oil and gas, someone else would. So if we reduce the fossil fuel footprint of the business, basically he's saying that in itself wouldn't help society, even though he's saying, yes, but we want to build renewables. So he made that.
He also kind of paraphrased the Oxford economist Colin Mayer's line about profitable solutions to the challenges of people and planet.
Yeah.
He kind of said that in somewhat different words.
But also illustrating your point about the double-edged sword. Even in the chat, in this session right now, there are people arguing essentially about whether the Georgia law was negative or positive. So, certainly the person who's arguing that it wasn't so bad is not going to be happy with Major League Baseball or Delta Airlines. But I want to bring in Jim Ledbetter here, who's my colleague and a longtime journalist, and I think he's waiting in the green room. There he is. Hey, Jim, you had a great question, and you can ask any question, but ask
Sure.
something. Go ahead.
It's maybe more of a comment than a question. I feel like the focus on profits in this discussion has been a kind of unfortunate narrowing of the argument and has the byproduct of missing some of the really crucial issues that I think distinguish stakeholder capitalism from traditional capitalism. One of those is about climate change, right? So the Milton Friedman line is companies should pursue profits within the rules of the game. Well, it's not illegal to burn fossil fuels. It turns out it's maybe a really bad idea for the planet, but it's not illegal. But a company that is willing to take that challenge on and switch to carbon neutrality is doing something beyond the mere search for profits. Another example is diversity. As long as you're not actively discriminating against someone, it's not illegal to run a company that's run just by straight white men, but it's not good for the society as a whole. Right? We want to advance everybody. We need to create jobs for people who have traditionally been shut out by corporations who were pursuing profit. So this idea that you can balance profits and purposes, I think, kind of misframes the issue by not looking at things that companies are failing to do that would, if they embrace them, make them more stakeholder capitalists.
And you think climate is a really good example there?
Yeah, I think climate's, historically, it was an externality for the vast majority of companies out there, something they didn't have to think about, didn't have to worry about. While in the meantime, the world is getting warmer, right? Or we're getting nearly catastrophic weather systems on a pretty constant basis. Today there are companies trying to take that on. There's also a bit of greenwashing going on. There's no question about that. There's lip service, et cetera. But I do think that that kind of taking on of broader social issues and incorporating them into the business is something that is distinct from the way that capitalism was practiced under the Milton Friedman mantra.
Well, thank you for your longtime journalist perspective. And I should just quickly mention, we are going to go beyond the hour, a few more minutes, as I had warned all our panelists, and I hope the audience can stick with us because we are having a meaty and somewhat, good dialogue here.
I might jump in on what Jim's comment was.
Yeah, please do.
And I think that the companies who understand this are the ones who currently have competitive advantage. Because if you do not understand the impact that you are having as a company on the environment, and you are not thinking about how you might influence that, it is going to come back to hurt you, either in terms of employees or customers, but importantly in how you operate. Because a simple thing such as understanding your business continuity plans has to take into consideration the new reality associated with our environment, and your ability to influence that, albeit one company at a time, is challenging. It is also what's required in order to lift all boats, to have everyone be able to operate in a better environment.
Yeah. Any other comments?
I ask every leader, is this a moral imperative or a competitive reality? None of them said it's a moral imperative. Some of them says it's both, and a good number of them says it's a competitive reality. And I think CEOs they may be motivated by their own personal values and their own morality and their beliefs, but that's not scalable. You really can't count on that if you really want businesses to address these other kinds of issues or solve different kinds of problems. But CEOs are pragmatic, and as Susan said, climate change presents very real threats to business, also opportunities. And you go stakeholder by stakeholder and say, competitive reality is I have to do certain things in order to win. And what differentiates us in this space? Do we have unique advantages? Is it material to my business? Will it really matter? Will we allocate resources to it? What will the impact be to our financial posture and so forth? These are very practical, real world decisions.
Yeah. Regarding this issue Andy made about, the point Andy made about companies, CEOs should feel free to express their views, but companies should stay out of it. One of the comments in the chat was, since Citizens United corporations were considered people for political purposes, maybe it's appropriate for them to behave like them also. It was just an interesting comment, and Andy, feel free to react to that. But if you're not desperate to do so, I have another question.
No. I mean, go ahead. You can move.
Well, there was a Q&A question, actually. Thank you. Appropriately asked in the Q&A by Allison Gross. Let me just quickly read it. Executive compensation has spiraled. In 2019, the ratio of CEO to worker compensation average pay in a company was 320 to 1, a massive increase from, well, she said 61 to 1 in 1989. Do you panelists believe that CEO compensation should be considered as part of purpose? And thank you, Kendall, for putting that on the screen. I think, and Andy said it's a different discussion, but it isn't necessarily a different discussion, is it?
Well, can I take the first crack?
Yeah, please.
A lot of CEO compensation is, they because of IRS laws, they're limited to a certain amount of annual salary, and a lot of the rest of it is part of their incentive structure and their equity. And so every time they do their job successfully and increase the profits of the company and grow it and hire more people, et cetera, their stock goes up and therefore their compensation goes up. So I'm not sure why we should have a big problem with that. You also find that the more successful a company is, the higher the wages are of the lower end workers that get pulled along. And so, I do have a problem, or I've had in the past, with some CEO that goes in there and gives himself all sorts of huge options and then just runs the company on a short-term basis, cashes out, and then the company collapses. But that's not what we're seeing with Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg and a lot of and Mark Benioff for that example. They do well because their companies do well and the equity has grown, but so has the value of what they provide.
Right. I must say, to some degree, I agree with you, since those statistics are based so much on the executive pay packages, which typically include options and shareholder positions of various sorts. And the astronomical numbers that we see quoted, every year are almost always a function of how the share price of that company performed that year. And it's not generally understood that very well by people who see those astronomical numbers. There aren't many companies that are giving a salary of 25 to 50 million to a CEO. I guess there may be some, but John,
David,
go ahead.
Yeah, let me just jump in on this one. The other way to address this issue is really thinking about how employees are paid in general. And there are several companies who've really thought about living wage. And so you see Unilever really setting some goals and targets about how a living wage should be paid to not only the entities that they control, but all their supplier network.
Right.
And you see Dan Schulman doing the similarly at PayPal. And so I think what we're seeing here is the responsibility of CEOs of really thinking about the people that work for them and within their ecosystem, and ensuring that they can live fairly and equitably without government assistance.
Yeah. Andy, do you have any problem with that?
Well, I mean, no, I think living wage is important for full-time employees, but many employees, for example, gig economy workers, even some Walmart workers and others, it's not a full-time pursuit. And so, there's a whole argument of $15 minimum wage, maybe the $7.25, whatever it is now, is too low. But every time you move it up, you're basically destroying jobs for those that are in the marketplace part-time, whether that be teenagers or those that are just looking for part-time employment. So you got to be careful about applying living wage mechanisms across the employment spectrum.
Okay, so many issues. I mean, we are going to have to sort of head towards wrapping up here. I have one general question, but I also welcome anybody who has sort of valedictory thoughts here. But the pandemic, I think it'll be worth just quickly touching on, if any of you have strong opinions about how this very bizarre period we are hopefully now finally emerging from has affected the perception of this issue. Susan, I think you might have some interesting thoughts on that.
I think the pandemic has, shown us that we do have a real existential threat. And we have all lived through this period together. And so it has really increased our awareness of our interconnectedness, and that every corner of the world relates to us as individuals and how we live our lives. And so I think this has accelerated the momentum on this topic, because it really indicates how businesses need to think and business leaders need to think. And importantly, it has called the question as to how businesses interact with their employees and the things they're willing and not willing to do relative to their employees. And so I think we have a new moment in time where people are seeing how important it is to have multiple considerations in making business decisions, even more so than ever.
And I know, Andy, you said it when we were doing our prep that Amazon is an interesting study in this, because of course Bezos has become the wealthiest person in the world, and I believe that transition did happen during the pandemic, or right before. I think it was during the pandemic. And meanwhile, if Amazon hadn't existed, the chances are most people on this meeting would have lived a worse life.
Well, they were a lifeline to a lot of people. Instead of going to stores, your doorstep was filled with those smiley boxes. But let me just add one thing in terms of profit and purpose, perhaps being much more intertwined. I haven't heard anyone complain about either the CEO pay or any of the corporate activists movements of Moderna or BioNTech or Pfizer or even Johnson & Johnson, who, because of their past investment in technology and R&D and the like, were able to, in very quick order, bring us vaccines. And no one seems to be complaining that they're very profitable companies now. And yet they provided the ultimate purpose, which is keeping so many of us alive and able to escape lockdowns and quarantines and the like.
Yeah.
And I might also add that their success was reliant upon their view of their whole ecosystem, their relationship with suppliers, their supply chain, collaboration with partners, working with government. You know, it took a village to make that happen.
And a great workforce.
Exactly.
David, I'll just on the pandemic. I think it was a masterclass out of necessity of stakeholder management by the C-suite. I mean, they were every day, all of them, all the disciplines, P&L leaders, functional leaders had to be together virtually, and they had to think about the needs, requirements, and expectations of stakeholders simultaneously. That's not normally what happens. HR takes care of that, P&L over here, marketing here, general counsel over there. But as a team, they had to think many times a day about employee safety, keeping the lights on, serving customers, thinking about suppliers, what happens to this, what happens to our financials, what about the investment community, solving for those connected requirements together. And Margaret Keane of Synchrony told me that's not going to stop now because they saw a superior way of working together as an executive team. This is not about society. This is about problem solving. This is about problem solving in a different way, but thinking about the problem differently, framing the problem not by stakeholder, but looking for those conjoined interests. And I think that will be very interesting to see if that emerges as a new way of frankly, companies being managed.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And to some extent, this whole conversation to me is reflective of, what Susan pointed out, transparency, but it's not just transparency, it's the availability of information and data about systems is more readily available than ever. And in a way, every decision in any field, personally or corporately, is probably almost certainly going to be better if it's done on a multifactorial basis. And the more things you can factor into a good decision, the better a decision it's likely to be. And in some ways, maybe this whole stakeholder capitalism argument is really just about a new ability to factor in a wider variety of business impacting elements than we've had access to in the past or sufficiently understood in the past. I'm sort of making my own closing statement here, but the one other thing I wanted to just throw out there it's not this discussion, but when Amazon comes up, it comes to my mind and it has to be mentioned. There is an issue of sheer scale relating to governments and companies relating to governments and the globe. This is an unresolved problem for society, and it isn't necessarily an issue of the social responsibility or the stakeholder management of Amazon, but their scale continues to grow, their global footprint continues to grow, and regulatory capabilities have not grown in parallel. And we have a massive challenge as a society, which we've discussed on other roundtables. But I just want to mention it as we wrap, that regardless of how you feel about Amazon's indispensability during this period, there is something very scary about companies getting that big in relation to the governments and the regulatory apparatus that oversees them. And we have to figure that out, especially as almost certainly a number of these companies will continue getting even bigger. I don't know if anybody has any comment on that.
You're segueing into an antitrust panel, and
which I don't really need to do, but I'm just making a related comment. You want to say anything about it, Andy, real fast?
No, I'm saying, it's a whole nother can of worms and talk about antitrust and how that comes about in a digital world that we're in versus the analog world of antitrust. It's another hour and a half minimum, Dave.
Well, it's another area where we haven't done sufficient multifactorial analysis as a society, maybe we could say. But maybe anybody has any final thoughts they want to throw in before we wrap at 15 minutes beyond the hour here? Susan or John or Andy, any of you have any last things you wanted to say you didn't get to?
I mean, I'll just say that there are more and more organizations looking at how business leaders lead and how companies perform. And Just Capital, being one of them, has noted that companies that lead out in their ability to manage the multiple complex needs of multiple stakeholders are companies that are outperforming their peers. And I think that we're going to see that happen more and more, because it's to the points that have been made throughout this whole session. Business is just more complex, it is more dynamic, and it requires more decency today than it ever has in order to win both labor and customers and allow for a brighter future for all of us.
Yeah, thank you for putting that word decency in there. That's a very good word. John.
Just want to reiterate that as much as some may feel this is a moral imperative, it is a competitive reality. And it isn't just for customers, as we said, it's for all the stakeholders who matter to a company. I asked Jacqueline Overgratz, so what should business schools be teaching that they're not teaching today to help for this era of stakeholder capitalism? And after thinking about it, she said, teach them to be better problem solvers. And that starts with framing the problem differently. So as you said, David, if you only frame the problem as product service for customers gain market share and margin, teams will solve for that. If it's frame the problem as we need to get more coders, data scientists, and designers to work for us, team will solve for that. Stakeholder capitalism says or suggests sometimes these things are conjoined as the same challenge or problem and solve for that. And people will. If CEOs will simply require it, ask it, or invite them to do that, to see the problem or the opportunity that way. And stakeholders will present new kinds of challenges, as we've discussed.
Well, thanks. Andy, any last thoughts that you wanted to say you didn't get to?
Well, no, I mean, I thought this was a great discussion, and companies should still find profitable solutions to the challenges of people and planets, and we'll all do better.
It's a good quote. Well, thank you all. Thank you to the audience for good questions and comments in the chat. And I think the Welcome platform has acquitted itself well. I found it quite enjoyable to use. So thank you to everybody and have a great day.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.